good morning, or whatever time of day it is for you folks. Today we're going to talk about planes, and I'm using a cube, traditional square cube, and also this kind of simple little birdhouse shape as an illustration to do this work. And this is a photograph of these subjects, the cube and this birdhouse. Here's the actual baby, if anybody cared to see that. And really the study is about planes. This could easily be a study of perspective, but we're going to kind of simplify the way that we're going to draw this cube and not worry so much at this point of perspective, where lines would travel out to real vanishing points. So it's kind of a more of simplified way of still capturing this pretty well. And then later in the course we're going to get into perspective. But what's really important at this point is to understand planes and what happens as flat areas meet other flat areas. In a sphere or a cylinder, we had something called a core. And that can only happen with objects that are rounded. And in that rounded area, there's a darkest area. When we have planes, there is no core. One of the illustrations here in a book, and this is a document that I also have uploaded, does a pretty good job of showing some areas here in planes. And probably the biggest thing that you have to keep in mind is how whatever subject is being lit. So like in my example is a 45-degree light. The top is the lightest, the side has some, in this illustration, sliding light, so it's darker, and then the area where light is really not getting to, where it's real dark. And then kind of like the sphere, it's like, well, why is it lighter in here if this is the dark side? It's back to that reflected light that's bouncing around and hitting part of the sides. Over in here, there's some reflected light over in here. So let me get rid of this and get to my illustration and quickly kind of go through a how-to in terms of how I arrived at this. When you're going to draw an object like a cube, the most important, or a building, if you were doing something outside and looking at an actual building and you wanted to draw in perspective, probably the most important line is that front line, that vertical line, the closest point to you, the viewer. And that's how this illustration started. Okay, so basically there's a straight line here, just kind of estimating how big that I want this thing to scale out to be. This is roughly like 3 inches. You could do yours maybe a little bit smaller when you're studying the subject. And then you have an imaginary line for base here. And what you're trying to do to get these angles for how far this, the more that you're going to see the side of a cube, the smaller you're going to have an angle here. Just like in the birdhouse, since I'm seeing more of the birdhouse here, there's a very small angle. We're seeing most of the side. Here, it's a little bit of more of an angle, and the side's traveling back, and it creates this angle. So what happens here with this angle, to keep this simple, these lines would actually pinch in and go toward a vanishing point. But just for what we're doing as an exercise, you could pretty much just have these lines be parallel. So what happens here repeats there. If they pinch in a little bit, that would be good. Be very careful that these lines do not start to fan outward. Totally impossible in terms of a real study if this was from a real cube. So here's one line. These lines I've estimated by eye the angle, looking at the subject and putting a line, holding a line across the bottom visually, like holding it up, and then trying to estimate that angle. So there's one line here, one line there. You'll see in the step-by-steps images, and then it drops a vertical. The vertical lines always stay 100% vertical, unless it's a very strange shape that doesn't have vertical lines, or if the thing is actually tilted over. So we're going to make life simple, that these verticals stay 100% vertical. This has a little bit more of an angle. So that means there's more foreshortening. This is going back further, faster into the distance. So it's a shorter side. Remember, the more severe the angle, if this was a real severe angle and we're only seeing a tiny bit of that side, we'd only be coming out to here roughly. We see very little bit of that side. So we're seeing, this from here to here is obviously longer than it is from here to here. Another thing to remember if you're drawing a cube is that there's no way that it could ever be longer than it is tall, because this is the actual shape. If you were looking straight on at a cube, okay, I'll do a little thing here and I can erase it. Looking straight on at a cube, this is what you would see. Okay? You would see this perfect square, and we're not seeing the top, we're not seeing the sides. The minute we start to turn it, then we're starting to see two of the sides. And if we're looking slightly down, we're even seeing part of the top. So let me get rid of this here for the most part and get back to this. I want to keep the pace moving so it doesn't get too long for everybody. So estimating this angle, this line repeats parallel to that line. We drop vertical to end that side. And then from those points, okay, if you have from here to here, all you're doing is repeating again a parallel line that's going to come out from this point going to the back. And if this is the front side over here, you're taking that and repeating that in terms of a parallel line that goes out there. Where those lines intersect is the back point, and there we have the definition of the top. If we could literally see through this cube like a fish tank, we'd see a vertical line dropping down there. We'd even see lines through here and here that would see through to the base. Don't worry about that. We'll get more into that when we actually do two-point perspective. So if we have this shape defined now one of the key things, and it does go through that in that exercise in the book, trying to get back to that page on planes. So one of the things they talk about here is reflected light, side lighting, and top lighting. But one of the most important phenomenons, and it's a very strange one because it's hard to define in terms of physics or actual existence, is that as a dark plane meets lighter sides. So here's the darkest side. As it meets this light side and it meets this light side, it actually gets a little darker right at the edges, okay, before it goes to that light area. So whenever you have a dark plane meeting a light plane, okay, it's going to get, even in here, you see it's a little bit darker as it's meeting that light side. So it's a little darker here as it meets that light side. What's interesting is the flip side of that is the absolute reciprocal phenomenon, where this has some tone, okay, and notice as that tone gets here, it gets lighter as it meets that dark side. And since this is dark to light, remember, whenever one plane meets another plane, just say to yourself, well, which is lighter, which is darker? Here's a plane where it's darker meeting the top where it's lighter, and notice it gets a little dark along the edge as it meets that lighter plane. So I'm doing the exact same thing in our study. Here's the light. Here, the brightest part gets a little bit lighter as it meets the dark one. Here's a little bit darker plane. It gets dark as it meets the light side, but it gets lighter as it meets the dark side. I know it may be a little confusing at first, but once you get it, you got it. It doesn't change. Here's the darkest side. Remember, light, little darker but light. So if this is the darkest, both of these edges are going to be darker as they meet those lighter planes that they're joining to on the sides. So you have that. Now, because of reflected light, I'm going through here and making it a little bit lighter in here. There's darkness here, and it's a little bit lighter, notice, in here from, yes, reflected light. So I have all kinds of notes on here. When you draw this, obviously, do not draw already in my notes. You're just trying to render it. These are here for your help. And there's little indications here, lighter at edges, okay, as it meets dark side. So I'm even indicating it in that illustration. And you have the stills and you have this video, so you should be armed with all the knowledge you need to do this well. Usually these would be two separate projects, one after the other, but because of the timing and the way the course is laid out for you folks in VIS 101, this here is a subject that's trying to now actually apply that to a real item rather than just a simple cube. And this is a little birdhouse. The only thing that makes this tricky is it has this overhanging roof that's in 4 panels that come up to a point. Okay, but once you get that drawn, you have the same concept of what's happening in the cube. So to do this once again, step 1, ask yourself what should be that first line. Remember where we started on this one? This one right here, same thing. This is the closest point to us. It's the vertical. And what happens when we drop that vertical? We start to estimate these angles. We're seeing less of this side, so it's a pretty strong angle that goes back here. This actually would go underneath, but we have the overhang, so I'm matching that pretty much to the roof line. We have this base here, this angle, okay, like from here to here. So here's a line, the parallel line to that, which is going to be the roof, is then drawn through here. But notice that this goes out further, and this goes out further out here. One of the things you're going to have to do by eye, which is very tricky, if you're looking at the subject, you're going to estimate this point at the top of the roof. You're going to look at it and say, how far is that from the base, from the top, from the part here going across? How far is it in terms of what's happening to these verticals? It's not directly over that, it's slightly up here to the right. I might be a little low or a little high. For what you're doing, it doesn't matter. Okay, it's more about the principle and about observation. So if your point is over here, if your point is over here, and it ends up being a little bit higher roof, it's not a problem, okay? But what you need to do is then, if you're estimating that point, take a look in terms of then where is that point we are trying to estimate, and where does this come down? How far does that come down over here in terms of where this parallel line from the base is going to go out and connect to that? I know it sounds hard, it's a little bit tricky, but again, underneath this roof is the same thing of what's going on here exactly, okay? The only difference is we're adding these triangular shapes to the top of the roof. And if you follow what I'm doing here, and if you look close at the video, and try and force yourself to really look at some observation and plant some of those points, you should be okay. You also have the opening to this birdhouse. To find the exact middle of that, you don't really have to draw it. If you draw it really light, I do show it in the stills, is if you make an X, if you went from this point to this point, and this point to this point, where they intersect will actually show the direct middle of that side. Since it's foreshortening, it's not directly in the middle. It goes a little bit more out toward the end, okay? And that's all because of, again, because we're not seeing it straight on. If we saw it straight on, this would be right smack in the middle. Because there's some foreshortening, even though we're seeing a lot of the sides, it's a little bit more to the right where it would be the center of that opening. And it's simply just verticals again. Always verticals, stay vertical, 100%. So here's your vertical drops for that, and here's a little arch top to it. And since no light is getting in there, it's super, super dark in terms of your pencil. So in here, here's your darkest side. As the darkest side meets a lighter side, notice it gets dark toward the edge. Here's some tone on the side, and there's that side that's has a certain tone, but it's lighter than this side. Notice how it gets light right along that edge. Okay, that's the key. That will help you tremendously. It's almost always happening when you are looking at and trying to understand planes. The last thing is you have this little wrap around. It kind of goes past here a little bit and here, and then adding another part to that base for that little tiny platform that it's on. Okay, So if you look, it's not right from here, it's like back a little bit.